Santa is Confused by Rupi Lal. Once upon a time, on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, in fact, Santa and Mrs. Claus were sat down in their favourite chairs, warming themselves up by an open fire. Mrs. Claus noticed that Santa looked quite peculiar, so she asked him, "Are you feeling okay?" He replied, "I am a little bit upset." Mrs. Claus asked, "Why?" Santa replied, "The reindeers have not wrapped the presents yet." Mrs. Claus thought to herself for a moment and said, "Santa, do the reindeers normally wrap presents?" Santa took a moment and had a thought, and then he replied, "No. I'm confused." Mrs. Claus asked Santa, "Is there anything else you might be confused about?" Santa took a moment, had a thought, and replied, "Yes, the elves are not ready to guide my sleigh tonight." Mrs. Claus then asked Santa, "Do your elves normally guide your sleigh?" Santa took a moment and thought to himself, "No. Well, I'm confused." Mrs. Claus said, "Well, it happens sometimes. But you know what will help? A hot drink. I will make you a nice cup of tea." "Ho, ho, ho! Yes, please," said Santa. Mrs. Claus replied, "Actually, on second thought, I'm going to make you something even better." Santa asked, "What could be better than a hot cup of tea?" Mrs. Claus said, "I will make you a hot chocolate with marshmallows." Santa said, "Ho, ho, ho! That would be magnificent." Mrs. Claus went into the kitchen and after a short while came back into the room holding a hot drink in Santa's very own mug. Santa smiled as he took a sip, but then he noticed something quite peculiar. The hot drink tasted very different. Santa asked Mrs. Claus, "Does hot chocolate usually taste like a hot cup of tea?" Mrs. Claus replied, "No." Then she took a sip of Santa's hot drink herself. After a moment, Mrs. Claus sat back down in her chair and said, I'm confused." The end.